Hello, everyone. Thanks to Dan and Sally for getting me here today and for organising this great event. My presentation follows on nicely from Phil's. He was probably more talking about the science side of things and that technical data. I am going to take a bit more of a step back and look at, well, what does that mean at a sector level, New Zealand level, and how can we do better next time. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of a background about Fresh Produce Safety Centre, why food safety is important in horticulture, if you haven't already figured that out from Phil's presentation. What I felt the initial response was, and I will say the first 30 days was pretty stressful because of, as you saw from Phil's presentation, there was a lot of unknowns. And then looking forward, what have we already done? I suppose reflecting, first of all, what have we already done over the last couple of years to strengthen food safety systems? And then what do we need to do more of going forward? So a bit about the Fresh Produce Safety Centre. We're across Australia and New Zealand, and our vision is safe produce and a thriving industry. So food safety is our priority, but also we want to make sure that growers can continue to produce and sell their product, so it is making it workable. We're an independent not-for-profit, and we work across Australia and New Zealand. And I said one of the things we're described as is a Switzerland in the food safety space, so we're not fighting in any particular camp. We're across the entire supply chain, and say across both of those countries. Established back in 2014 by International Fresh Produce Association and University of Sydney, and primarily to bridge that gap between science and on-farm implementation. There was some good information out there, but then wasn't usable for growers. There are a lot of gaps in the science. As Phil has pointed out, there's still a lot of gaps in the science. We work very closely with researchers, including the New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre, to fill those gaps. And how we're funded, range of players, but primarily by retailers, regulators, and industry. So in terms of our purpose then, the main purpose is to create those guidelines for growers, and we want them to be independent, we want to be based in science. They do help growers as the how-to to meet the regulatory requirements and their GAP standards, but it is supposed to be that interface between science and what's practical on farm. We also facilitate projects that raise awareness around food safety and do a whole lot of things, let's say from research all the way through to implementation, extension, and continuous improvement. Do some food safety events like our symposium, which is held in Sydney every year. It's in July next year. If you want to put that in the calendar, come on over and have a look. And one of the main benefits, I suppose, because of our funding model, all the information is freely available for growers. So that's quite an important aspect of what we do. The main reason we were established was to take hold of these guidelines for fresh produce food safety, and we're the current custodians. We've also developed some quick guides, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So in terms of our stakeholders, we're well connected across all aspects of the supply chain, from input suppliers through to retailers, and all the support systems, whether you're a consultant or laboratories, universities, the assurance programs. So that's Switzerland there, right in the middle of the Tasman, and we're funded by, we work with all these stakeholders, so it's quite a big job in some ways. But collaboration is key. So, moving on to food safety and why it's important in fresh produce. If you guys already don't know, one of the main things, the main attribute of fresh produce is that it doesn't have a kill step. In dairy, you can pasteurize. In meat, you generally cook. But in a lot of fresh produce, it is not cooked. So, therefore, we need to manage our food safety risks on farm and make sure that we're not getting the food contaminated in the first place. So this is an Australian bull rather than a New Zealand one, but you can see some good practice here where they've segregated. There's no animals in the paddock. They're not contaminating the produce. But as I said, the main thing that growers have to do and have to be aware of is managing that food safety risk on farm. So let's make sure that it doesn't get contaminated in the first place. A very simple line that came from our keynote speaker at the symposium this year, from Jim Monaghan, who's a professor in crop science at University of Harper Adams in the UK, and his line was "keep it clean." And I think really simple message for growers. Ultimately, what the GAP programs and regulations are basically directing growers to do: keep it clean. If it's not contaminated in the first place, so then you don't have to worry about decontamination, which is very difficult in horticulture. And the reason why I'm here today is to talk about floodwaters and the risks that they can introduce. This is a photo from the Waikato in June 22, so it was pre-cyclone, and if you guys remember, this was in Stuff, and it was widely shared. A grower that had the innovation to go and harvest their broccoli in a kayak. I was in Ireland at the time when I got this news, and I was delighted to have to deal with it. Luckily, they weren't a certified grower, so I didn't have to deal with that aspect of it. But interesting how it was promoted so much, the innovation, but they weren't really thinking about the food safety risks. So I'll loop back to this one at the end as well. So looking at food safety trends and risks, we've got quite a lot of foodborne illness in the world, and horticulture, and a lot of these issues have been attributed to horticulture. In places like America, 50% of their foodborne illness is attributed to horticulture. In New Zealand, we do pretty well, and I'm not sure if it's because we're not looking or because we have really good food safety systems in place, and I like to think it's the latter, but something that we probably do need to look into a little bit. But in Australia, we've seen that horticulture is associated with about half of the recalls. So it's not just about the consumer safety, it's also that economic impact. It's huge when you consider the amount of recalls that are going on. And that also erodes consumer trust, which is impacting on the amount that we can sell. A report that came out earlier this year from New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre on mega trends in food safety and their impacts on megatrends and their impacts on food safety. So no surprise to anyone here that we have an increase in the severity and the severity and the frequency of these major weather events like floods and droughts at the other side. We have climate change driving resource depletion. So while growers need potable water generally in post-harvest, and if they can pre-harvest, it's ideal. But as resources become more depleted, growers are looking at using surface water and treated water, and that's introducing additional risks into the production system. We also have increased spread of animal and plant pathogens. Proximity of animals to production is a problem, as well as manure has been used. While it's really good for sustainability, it does introduce food safety risks. Join in. And then lastly, we have an increase in mycotoxins, ag-chem residues, and antimicrobial resistant pathogens. We have different production systems as well. We introduce things like crop covers, and that's impacting on the UV, and that's having a food safety impact. So while it's solving one problem in terms of pest control, maybe it's introducing another problem when it comes to breakdown of pathogens and agrochemicals. So thinking about the cyclone, the initial response post-event is that guidance was being shared with growers and people all around across the food safety system. So there are some good guidelines through Fresh Produce Safety Centre and others. Unfortunately, in Australia, they're quite used to floods, so they've got quite good information that was shared across. In New Zealand, growers are directed not to harvest, as we've already heard a couple of times today, any produce that had touched the floodwaters. Growers' packhouses were also directed to segregate high-risk produce, so if it was, even if it wasn't in the floodwaters, if it came from a block that had been flooded, well then that was considered higher risk, and potentially just as a precaution, they were putting some of those additional mitigations in place and treatments that Phil described. And in the apple and kiwi fruit industry especially, growers got some really good support and advice on the additional things that they could be doing, things with the bins, with their equipment, with their people, and the additional testing and monitoring that they could be doing just to ensure that everything was in place, as well as cleaning being a really key step, especially given all the mud. Then on the market side, there was increased inspections happening. If you're a retailer or a buyer or an exporter, they were quite concerned about all the things that Phil talked about. So they really ramped up their inspections just to make sure that, I suppose, no one was been tempted to harvest contaminated product. And there were some, I certainly heard some cases of it, but I don't know how widespread it was. So yeah, they just added that in as an insurance step as well. And New Zealand Food Safety developed some guidelines for harvested product that had been in contact with floodwaters. A bit like Phil said with the testing regime, we weren't quite ready, and we're developing guidelines in the middle of a crisis, which is not a very good approach. And I was in the middle of a lot of phone calls then from growers and others saying, we need guidelines, and it was really stressful and frustrating from a grower's perspective and from mine as well. On the consumer side, they were advised not to eat the free food that they were finding lying around the place. So a bit like the broccoli example earlier, people were not really making that connection between flooded product and potential food safety risks. So how do we do at managing the food safety risks? Well, as far as I'm aware, there were no outbreaks attributed to fresh produce, so that's a really good sign from a food safety perspective. But of course, this had a major economic impact from a grower's perspective because they had to make really tough calls not to harvest product. And to Phil's point on the, is it just above the flood line or is it 30 centimetres? I mean, there's quite a lot of product in that area. So, some really tough decisions made by growers. But I think this is a good news story in the sense that we didn't have any issues in food safety. So think about some of the initial lessons learned. I'm sure this is going the other way, sorry. I think fairly clear that we had quite a fragmented approach, and this was noted by other sectors as well, and regulators said that it was easier to interact with other sectors. Horticulture by its nature has a lot of different products and a lot of different organisations involved, so it was unfortunate that we had a fragmented approach, but also people were impacted differently. We've already heard earlier on about communications being fragmented as well, and that was something that we certainly need to work on. Gaps are identified in guidance from a grower's perspective and from an industry's perspective, and some of those are still there today, but we have done some work of filling those gaps. Research from Plant and Food, this same probably similar project that Phil was talking about there, funded by Apples and Pears, looked at what went well, and what they found is that when there was a well-established food safety culture, that they were much better equipped to respond to the food safety risks, and we've seen that happening a couple of times today as well. So that's food safety culture been a brilliant insurance policy. An immediate risk assessment is absolutely needed, and that's to determine what's the best course of action. And as we've seen, it's not just within a product or within a growing operation. We're seeing like that risk assessment at a paddock level and a row level and a tree level in many ways. So there's so many things that need to be considered, but that immediate risk assessment been absolutely paramount. And the last thing here was around having trained people for doing the sampling and testing. I think this is something that happens across the board in the horticulture space, where we have contamination of samples leading to false positives, and then that's an economic impact from a grower, and they feel like they've had a positive result when it's just actually a contaminated sample. So in the haste to get out there and get samples and get tests done, we were seeing that there were some issues in that space. Then looking at the information side of things, quite a few information gaps, unfortunately, but one was about having a risk assessment on product that's not ready for harvest. So it was quite clear cut in terms of product that's ready to be harvested. If it's been submerged, don't harvest. But what if it's not going to be harvested for a week or 2 weeks or 2 months or 4 months? Can we harvest? And that grey area was really, really challenging. I think it kind of still is today, unfortunately. When can flooded soil be replanted? And I think quite a lot of work has been done on this. So if we're looking at that 60-day mark, that seems quite reasonable to me, and it's aligned with what we're seeing in manures as well. But also, that hasn't necessarily been brought into the guidelines for growers yet, as far as I'm aware. Then, touched on this a bit already, but risk-based and cross-specific guidelines, because kiwi fruit and apples are quite different, and as our carrots and broccoli all have different risk profiles, and it depends on how it's consumed, it depends on how it's grown, it depends on can you sanitize? Certain things can be, certain things can't be. So having a risk-based approach that enables the cross-specific guidance, because that's what a grower ultimately needs. Mentioned this a bit already, but what treatments can be applied and should be applied post-harvest. So in some cases you can wash apples, but there's other products you can't wash. So it's all well and good having that in the guidance, but if it doesn't apply to your product, well then that doesn't really work. What are the buffer zones around and above? So we've heard 10 centimetres above the flood, 30 centimetres above the flood lines, but we've heard in the guidance that came out from New Zealand Food Safety was 10-metre buffer around the flood line as well. So again, that was quite significant, but does that need to be revised, and is that scientific? All those sorts of things that we need to look at. That 30 centimetre zone is probably something to do with splashing, how far does it go, and that is a bit subjective maybe in some ways, but risk associated with splashing needs to be considered. And then what do we do with the product that's not going to be consumed, but we can't just leave it rotting in the field? Am I going to mulch it in? Am I going to plough it back in? Am I going to harvest it and compost? There were various decisions being made there, but I don't think there is guidance on it. And I must add one, it would be around wind fallen fruit, has come up recently with the winds in avocado industry, and it was mentioned earlier on as well that wind hasn't really been talked about, and I realise I didn't have it in my presentation either, but certainly an impact as well. What do we do with fallen fruit? And again, it's a little bit like the fruit that has been submerged, it's considered not for sale. Some other challenges then at a more macro level is that we talked about the fragmented approach, and we don't have readiness response plans. Different approaches, different sectors. If you're apples or your kiwi fruit, you had your approaches that were driven by those product groups, which was great. But then what if you were growing sweet corn, and what if you were growing carrots? You weren't getting necessarily that same level of support. There wasn't that one source of truth. There was a lot of information coming from a lot of different angles, and maybe we didn't have that centralised knowledge hub, and lacking awareness of roles and responsibilities across the system. So who's doing policy, who's doing guidelines, who's doing comms? We didn't really have those roles and responsibilities. So onto a positive note, how can we do better? So at the time, HortNZ, NZ GAPA and United Fresh started thinking about what we would do better in future and how could we come together in this space. So a bit of work has been done over the last couple of years, and more recently Fresh Produce Safety Centre, New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre and New Zealand Food Safety have come on board with this better approach. So this is just a schematic of the food safety system and how we might strengthen it. So if you've got issues, maybe it's a flood at the top, you're going to do some research, develop guidelines, implement them on farm. At some stage, those things do get codified or brought into standards, and that goes into the assurance programs, and we can monitor improvement then based on how we're implementing those standards, and that's our continuous improvement cycle. But we need to get this implemented and into a prepared state rather than starting at the problem identification just the day after the cyclone, which is kind of what happened. So the network is looking to facilitate better communication, better collaboration across the board, strategic alignment between all the organisations that are involved in the network, and kind of think about how we can prepare better for these future events. I'm all out of time. That's not a very good sign. So I'll skip through quite quickly the last what we're proposing. So these are some of the existing groups that there are. There's groups that are looking at emerging risks, groups that are collaborating on science, groups that are collaborating on gap standards, a community of practice, and we have Food and Beverage Forum, which is across all of the food systems. So this network could help connect all of those and give them a real purpose with aligned goals of improving food safety. The guidelines that Phil has already talked about, these were just launched last week. And we've got new chapters on food safety culture and managing critical incidents. So that's something that's happened since the cyclone and absolutely was a major driver in getting better stuff happening in this space. We've also got this chapter on the grower level incident management plan. I'll skip through it, but basically has a risk-based approach for how growers will manage incidents. I think food safety being one of the things inside a wider thing around incident management like a flood. So in terms of how we would enhance that approach, we've got grower incident management plans, we've got SIMs, we've got civil defence doing their thing, the council doing their thing, we've got Horticulture Advisory Group was talked about earlier on. They're looking at developing more of those kind of networks around the country where like in Pukekohe in Canterbury, where the grower collectives are coming together a little bit better. But we still are missing this industry level incident management plan, which is something I'm quite interested in, and how does it link in with biosecurity and lots of other things that are going on. And we also need to improve our food safety awareness and comms. Linking back to our broccoli grower, this is reported in Stuff to say that it's believed that broccoli should be okay in the water as long as it's getting plenty of sunlight. So the broccoli is okay, but is it safe? So that's a takeaway message there. And I'm not going to talk too much about next steps, but it is just doing more of the same of what we're doing, but ultimately it's about collaborating more effectively and moving forward. So to finish up, acknowledge all these groups, but also Apples and Pears and Plant and Food and New Zealand Phil and the Centre for all the work that they were doing, and the Horticulture Food Safety Initiative project, which has funded the review of the guidelines and the work that we've done in developing those chapters on food safety culture and critical incident response. Thank you very much.